Number A. Single dad. Janitor interrupted the meeting, then solved a $100M crisis in one move. In a conference room worth more than most people earn in a lifetime, 20 of the highest-paid minds in the company were locked in a battle they were losing. Expensive suits, custom watches, degrees from universities that charged more per year than a family home. They argued over equations, over data models, over numbers that had grown so large they no longer felt real. And in the far corner of that same room, a man pushed a mop across the floor, unhurried, methodical, invisible. Nobody looked at him. Nobody had any reason to, until he spoke, and the room turned on him so fast it felt like a reflex. They threw him out. They dismissed him with the kind of casual contempt that requires no effort, no thought, no guilt. But less than 10 minutes later, that same man walked back through that door, stepped up to the whiteboard, and drew something so simple that the silence it produced was almost violent. $100 million. One move. One person nobody had bothered to see. Elias Carter was 38 years old, and most mornings he was awake before the sun had any right to be up. Not because he wanted to be, not because he had somewhere exciting to go. He was awake because Lily needed breakfast, and because her school shoes had developed a crack along the left sole that he hadn't had the money to fix yet, and because the night shift at Halcyon Systems ended at 2 in the morning, which meant he had, on a good night, about 4 hours of sleep before his daughter came padding down the hallway with her hair in her face and her arms already reaching for him. He was the kind of tired that doesn't show up in a single night. It accumulates. It settles into the shoulders, into the jaw, into the space behind the eyes. He moved through his evenings at the corporate headquarters with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned that being unnoticed was a form of protection. He knew the layout of every floor. He knew which executive stayed late on Tuesdays and which one left a half-eaten sandwich on the conference table every Thursday night. He knew the security guard who liked to talk about his daughter's soccer games, and he knew the code to the supply closet on the 41st floor without having to look it up. He was a janitor. That was the word on his badge. That was the box people checked when they registered his presence and then immediately dismissed it. But Elias Carter had not always been a janitor. He had once sat in rooms not entirely unlike the ones he now cleaned. He had once written on whiteboards not entirely unlike the ones he now erased at the end of the night. He had a degree in computer engineering from a university that had cost him 8 years of student loans he was still paying down. He had once been the youngest lead systems architect in the history of a company that no longer existed in a form he recognized. That was 6 years ago. 6 years since a project he had built had been declared catastrophically flawed. 6 years since his name had been attached to a failure so public and so expensive that it had effectively ended his career in a single afternoon. He had tried, for a while, to explain. He had sent emails that went unanswered. He had filed documentation that disappeared into administrative silence. And then his wife had left, and Lily had needed stability, and the bills had kept coming, and at some point Elias had quietly stopped trying to fight a battle he couldn't see the edges of and had simply found a way to survive. He still read. Late at night, after his shift, he would sit at the kitchen table with Lily asleep upstairs and read systems architecture journals and machine learning papers on his laptop, with the brightness turned down low. He still understood everything. He understood it the way a musician understands rhythm, even when they haven't played in years, not as a memory, but as a reflex. And every night, when he wheeled his cart through the executive floor and paused beside the whiteboard in the main conference room, his eyes would travel across whatever equations or diagrams had been left behind, and his mind would quietly, involuntarily, continue the work that the room's occupants had abandoned for the evening. He never said anything. He simply cleaned and watched and understood things nobody knew he understood. The crisis at Halcyon Systems had begun quietly, the way most disasters do. A new financial AI platform, one that had taken 31 months and nearly $80 million to build, had gone live 3 weeks earlier, and for the first week, it had performed exactly as intended. The numbers had looked clean. The projections had been elegant. The board had approved bonuses before anyone had looked closely enough to notice that something, somewhere deep inside the system's decision logic, had begun to drift. By the second week, the drift became a pattern. By the end of the third week, the pattern had become a catastrophe. The platform was generating risk assessments that bore no consistent relationship to reality. It was flagging stable investments as volatile and rating genuinely dangerous positions as conservative. 2 institutional clients had already pulled their accounts. 3 more were threatening to. The total projected exposure, once the legal team had run their numbers, was $100 million, and that figure assumed they stopped the bleeding within 48 hours. Victoria Hale had learned about the full scope of the crisis on a Wednesday morning, and by Wednesday afternoon she had assembled every relevant mind in the building into the large conference room on the 41st floor. Victoria was 42 years old, and she had run Halcyon Systems for 4 years with the kind of precision that either inspired deep loyalty or chronic anxiety, depending on where you sat in the org chart. She was not someone who raised her voice. She did not need to. She had a way of asking a question that made the question itself feel like a verdict, and the people in that room had all felt it at one point or another. Beside her sat Daniel Brooks, the company's chief technology officer. Daniel was 45, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with the confidence of a man who had been told he was exceptional so many times that he had simply stopped questioning it. He had built a career on knowing the right thing to say in the right room at the right moment. Tonight, however, he was struggling. He had been struggling for 3 days, though he had managed to communicate this fact to no one in a way that acknowledged its full severity. There were 20 people in that room. Data scientists, machine learning engineers, 2 external consultants who charged more per hour than Elias earned in a week, and a row of senior analysts who had been printing out system logs since Sunday and still couldn't isolate the root failure. They had been in that room for 6 hours. The whiteboard was covered in branching diagrams and circled error codes and a timeline that someone had revised 4 times. The air had the particular quality of a space where intelligent people have been wrong for so long that confidence has curdled into something closer to stubbornness. The clock on the wall showed 9:17 in the evening. 47 hours remained. Elias arrived on the 41st floor at 9:45, exactly as his schedule required. He had cleaned the break room, restocked the paper towels in the small bathroom near the stairwell, and was moving his cart down the hallway toward the executive conference room when he heard voices through the closed door. Tense, overlapping, occasionally sharp. He did not intend to listen. He positioned his cart outside the door, knocked twice out of habit, and when no one answered and the voices continued, he pushed the door open enough to begin collecting the empty coffee cups and water bottles that had migrated to the small side table near the entrance. Standard procedure. Most people ignored him entirely. He kept his eyes down as he worked. But the whiteboard was directly in his line of sight, and within 90 seconds he had taken in everything written on it. His mind processed it the way it always did, automatically, structurally, without any decision on his part. He saw the architecture they were working from. He saw the logic tree they had constructed to trace the error. And he saw, with a clarity that felt almost uncomfortable, exactly where they had gone wrong. The system's anomaly wasn't in the code they were examining. It wasn't in the data pipeline, or in the input parameters, or in any of the 3 areas they had circled and underlined and assigned subteams to investigate. The error was in the feedback mechanism, the way the system had been learning from its own outputs, and using those outputs to reinforce future decisions. A subtle but catastrophic weighting bias had been introduced somewhere in the early training phase, and the system had been amplifying that bias with every iteration. It hadn't been visible immediately because the error's effects were gradual, accumulating like interest. By the time the effects were large enough to see, the underlying cause was buried under months of compounded learning. Elias recognized it because he had built something almost identical 7 years ago. He had been the one to catch that exact same category of error in his own architecture before everything that came after had buried the fact of it. He stood very still for a moment, holding a paper coffee cup in each hand, staring at the whiteboard. He thought about Lily asking him last week, in the particular careful way that 8-year-olds ask questions when they are trying to understand something that adults seem reluctant to explain, whether it was true that he used to be good at computers. He had told her yes. She had nodded and gone back to her drawing, apparently satisfied. He had not been satisfied at all. He took a slow breath. He thought about saying nothing. He thought about how easy it would be to finish his route, clock out, drive home, and not think about any of this until it was already over. He was still thinking when his elbow caught the handle of his mop bucket. The clatter was not dramatic. It was the ordinary sound of metal against tile, sudden and flat, and entirely out of place in a room full of people who had forgotten anyone else was present. Several heads turned. Victoria Hale turned last, and when she did, her expression did not change so much as it sharpened. She looked at Elias the way she looked at anything that had entered her field of attention without permission, directly, without warmth, with the immediate question of what purpose it served. "You can finish that later," she said. It was not a request. Elias picked up the mop handle. His mouth opened before he had fully decided to let it. "I'm sorry," he said, "but I think the issue is in the waiting in the feedback loop. The system is reinforcing a bias from the initial training data." The silence that followed lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Then Daniel Brooks laughed. Not cruelly, exactly. More the way someone laughs when a situation presents an absurdity too obvious to let pass without acknowledgement. "I'm sorry," Daniel said, and his tone implied he was not. "Facilities," Elias said, which was the word on his badge and therefore the most accurate and least adequate answer he had ever given. Victoria had already looked away. "Please finish your work elsewhere. We'll have someone notify you when the room is clear." The security officer stationed near the door was already moving. Elias did not resist. He placed the empty cups on his cart, straightened his badge, and walked out of the room without looking back at the whiteboard. The door closed behind him with a quiet click that felt, in that moment, considerably heavier than its actual weight. He stood in the hallway for a long time. Through the long, narrow window beside the conference room door, he could see the whiteboard. He could see Daniel at the front of the room, pointer in hand, redirecting the team's attention to a section of code that was not the problem. He watched them chase the wrong answer with the focused energy of people who had been awake too long and were no longer questioning their own assumptions. 46 hours remained, give or take. He thought about Lily. He thought about the way she had looked at him last Tuesday morning when he had dropped her off at school, standing on the sidewalk in her coat with the collar turned up, waving at him with one hand while holding her lunchbox with the other, entirely unaware of how much of his life was organized around making sure she never had a reason to stop waving like that. He thought about what he had been and what he had been made into, and the long, careful distance between the two. And then he thought about something Lily had said to him 6 months ago, in the back seat of the car, in the particular distracted voice she used when she was thinking out loud and had forgotten he could hear her. She had said, "I think the bravest thing is when you know you're right and everyone thinks you're wrong and you say it anyway." He had asked her where she'd heard that. She had shrugged and said she made it up. He looked at the whiteboard one more time. He looked at Daniel pointing at the wrong section with complete authority. He looked at the clock. He straightened his jacket. He knocked on the door. And then, before anyone answered, he opened it and walked back in. The reaction was immediate and collective. Several people at the table turned with expressions ranging from confusion to irritation. Daniel stopped mid-sentence. Victoria looked up from the document in front of her, and for a fraction of a second her expression was something he had not expected. Not anger, but a kind of sharp, involuntary curiosity, the look of someone who has just registered an anomaly their brain hasn't yet categorized. Then her jaw tightened. "I'll need to call security." 30 seconds, Elias said. His voice was level, not loud, not apologetic. "If I'm wrong, you've lost 30 seconds. If I'm right, you've saved the company." Nobody moved. He had calculated on this that in a room full of people who had been failing for 3 days, 30 seconds from an unexpected source carried more weight than it might have otherwise. Victoria's eyes held his for a moment that felt considerably longer than it was. 30 seconds, she said. He walked to the whiteboard. He was aware of every person in the room watching him. He was aware of Daniel's stillness, which was a different kind of stillness than the others, not uncertain, but guarded. He picked up the blue marker and did not hesitate. He did not erase everything. He cleared a specific section, the decision-weighting architecture in the system's reinforcement loop, and beside it, he drew something new. It was not complicated. That was the point. He drew 3 connected nodes, labeled them in less than a minute, and then stepped back. The error isn't in the input data or the code logic, he said. It's here. He circled the middle node. The system is being trained on its own outputs. Every prediction it makes feeds back into its next training cycle. There's a bias in the original weighting from the initial dataset. It's small, but the feedback loop amplifies it with every iteration. After 3 weeks of live operation, the amplification has compounded to the point where the system's risk assessments are essentially inverted in certain asset categories. The room was quiet. To fix it, he continued, you don't need to rebuild the architecture. You need to adjust a single weighting parameter in the feedback mechanism, reduce the self-reinforcement coefficient by approximately 40%, and reintroduce a validation gate that cross-references the system's outputs against an external baseline before each learning cycle. That breaks the amplification loop. The system recalibrates within hours. He put the cap back on the marker. He looked at Victoria. She was not looking at the whiteboard. She was looking at him. Daniel recovered first. That's a significant oversimplification, he said, and his voice had the careful quality of someone constructing an argument in real time. We've already examined the weighting parameters. The values are within acceptable ranges, within the ranges defined by the system's own internal benchmarks, Elias said, which are themselves products of the biased training cycle. You're using a ruler made by the same process you're trying to measure. A woman near the middle of the table, one of the external consultants, leaned forward slowly and looked at the diagram on the whiteboard. Her name was Sandra Pierce, and she had a reputation for being the person in the room who would say out loud what others were reluctantly thinking. She pulled her laptop closer and began typing. 3 minutes passed. Sandra looked up. She looked at Daniel, then at Victoria, and then at the man standing at the whiteboard in a gray facilities uniform with a Halcyon Systems badge clipped to his chest. He's right, she said. The self-reinforcement coefficient is sitting at 0.93. That should be capped at 0.55 for a system with this training dataset profile. I don't know how we missed it. A second analyst was already running the corrected parameters through a simulation model on the shared screen at the far end of the table. The room watched the simulation run in a silence so complete that the ventilation system was audible. The numbers on the screen shifted. The error curves flattened. The risk assessment outputs aligned with the external validation data for the first time in 3 weeks. The simulation completed. The screen showed a green status indicator. Nobody said anything for a long moment. Then Victoria Hales set down the pen she had been holding and looked at Elias with an expression that was entirely new. Not warmth, exactly, but the full, undivided weight of her attention, the same attention she gave to anything she had determined, was genuinely significant. Who are you? She asked. And this time the question was not rhetorical. He told her the short version. Elias Carter, former lead systems architect. He had built a financial modeling platform 6 years ago that had been declared a catastrophic failure in a very public and very damaging way. His name had been attached to it. His career had ended shortly thereafter. The room had gone very quiet in a different way now. Not the quiet of people waiting for the next development in a technical crisis, but the quiet of people recalibrating something more fundamental, their understanding of what they were actually in the middle of. Victoria asked the question without looking away from him. What company? He told her. She knew it. Several people at the table knew it. The failure had been significant enough to circulate in industry conversations for a year afterward. Elias watched understanding move across Victoria's face in the particular way that understanding moves when it is rearranging something that was previously settled. "That project?" she said carefully. The post-mortem report attributed the critical error to a flaw in the foundational architecture, introduced at the design phase. "Yes," Elias said. "That's what the report said. And you were the lead architect." "I was. But I didn't introduce that flaw." He said it without heat, without the defensive urgency of someone who has been waiting 6 years for the chance to say it. He said it the way you state a fact about the weather. "I identified it during the final pre-launch review and flagged it formally in writing. I was told it had been corrected. It hadn't been. When the system failed, the documentation of my flag had been removed from the project record." The silence that followed was a different quality again. Daniel Brooks had not moved in some time. He was sitting very still at the table with his hands flat in front of him. And for the first time that evening, he was not the largest presence in the room. Something about his stillness had changed. It was no longer guarded. It had become the particular stillness of a person who has realized, with sudden and unwelcome clarity, exactly where the next 30 seconds are going. Victoria turned her head and looked at him. She did not ask him anything. She simply looked at him, and the quality of that look was such that 3 people at the table instinctively shifted in their chairs. "I'd like the original project documentation pulled," Victoria said to no one in particular, but with the absolute certainty of someone who already knows what it will show. Tonight, the documentation took 40 minutes to locate and another 20 minutes to parse. Victoria sat at the conference table and read in silence while most of the room waited. Elias had been offered a chair, which he had taken without comment, and which felt strange in a way he couldn't immediately identify, not unwelcome, but disorienting, the way returning to a familiar room after a long absence can be simultaneously recognizable and wrong. What the documentation showed was not complicated, once you knew what to look for. There was Elias's original flag, time-stamped and formatted in the standard internal reporting structure. There was the acknowledgement logged against it by the senior technical reviewer, and there was the absence, conspicuous and unambiguous, of any record showing that the flagged issue had been investigated, escalated, or resolved. In the version of the documentation that had been submitted to the post-mortem investigation, that flag did not exist. The metadata told its own story. Daniel Brooks resigned before Victoria had finished reading. He did it by standing up, taking his jacket from the back of his chair, and saying, in a voice that had lost all of its earlier assurance, that he needed to speak with legal counsel before continuing the meeting. Victoria told him that was his right. She also told the head of HR, who was present at the table, to initiate a formal review under the company's conduct policy, and that Daniel's system access should be suspended pending the outcome. She said both of these things in the same tone, with the same tempo, without raising her voice. There was no satisfaction in it that Elias could see. Simply precision. Daniel left. Nobody watched him go except Elias, who watched him with an expression that was not triumph and not anger and not relief, but something quieter and more complicated. 6 years was a long time to carry something. The weight of it did not disappear just because the record had been corrected, but it shifted. Something that had been pressing inward for 6 years released, just slightly, and the space it left behind felt unfamiliar. Sandra Pierce, across the table, looked at him for a moment and then looked away. No one said anything about the 6 years. There wasn't a sentence adequate to it, and the people in that room were smart enough to know it. Victoria dismissed the team at 12:30 in the morning. Sandra and 2 senior engineers stayed behind to implement the system correction, which, exactly as Elias had described, stabilized the platform within 2 hours. The $100 million exposure narrowed to a projected loss of under $4 million, most of which was recoverable through renegotiated client agreements. By the following evening, 2 of the 3 threatened institutional clients had been retained. Before the room emptied, Victoria asked Elias to stay. They sat on opposite sides of the conference table, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Victoria had a particular stillness that Elias had observed throughout the evening. Not coldness, exactly, but a quality of containment, of careful economy in everything she did and said. Up close, without the pressure of crisis filling the space between them, he could see something beneath it that the crisis hadn't left room for. A kind of weariness. The specific fatigue of someone who has been the sharpest person in most rooms for a very long time and has found this to be less satisfying than anticipated. "I want to offer you your position back," she said. "Not the position you held 6 years ago. Something more accurate to what you actually did. Chief Systems Architect." He didn't answer immediately. She waited. She was good at waiting, he had noticed that. "I'm not asking you to decide tonight," she said. "I'm asking you to consider it." "I'll consider it," he said. "But I need something understood from the start. If I do come back, tell me. No buried documentation. No adjusted records. No conversation that happens in a room that doesn't have a paper trail. Whatever I flag, it stays flagged. Whatever I find, it stays found. I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking for a system that doesn't require me to fight the record to do my job." Victoria held his gaze for a moment. "That's not an unusual request," she said quietly. "It's the minimum standard. Then it should be easy to agree to." Something moved in her expression. Not quite a smile, she didn't seem like someone who arrived at smiles easily, but something in the direction of one. "It should be," she said, and meant it. He stood to leave. She did not move to stop him, but there was a pause brief, almost imperceptible, in which she seemed about to say something further and then reconsidered. He noticed it. He suspected she knew he had noticed it. Neither of them addressed it. But in that pause, something had shifted in the way she looked at him, not as a problem that had been solved or a resource that had been identified, but as a person she had not yet fully seen. And the realization appeared to be as new to her as it was to him. 2 days later, on a clear Saturday morning, Elias drove Lily to the office. She had asked to see where he worked, the nighttime building she had heard him describe, with its long corridors and quiet floors, and the elevator that he said had a view of the whole city if you arrived before sunrise. He had not yet told her about everything that had happened. He was still working out how to explain it in a way that an 8-year-old would understand. They rode the elevator to the 41st floor. The building was quiet on weekends, a skeleton staff, a few engineers, the distant mechanical hum of servers in the data center 2 floors down. Lily stood at the window at the end of the main corridor and looked out at the city stretching away in every direction. And her eyes were the particular size of eyes that have encountered something larger than anticipated. "Is this where you work?" she asked. "It's where I've been working," he said. "It might be where I keep working, in a different way." She thought about this for a moment. Then she looked at him. "Are you a hero now?" He laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind that surprises you by arriving before you've prepared for it. "No," he said. "Not even close. But you did a brave thing." He crouched down so he was at her level, the way he always did when he wanted to say something important. She watched him with her mother's eyes, serious and very clear, and not easily fooled. "I did something I should have done a lot sooner," he said. "And it cost me a few things that it shouldn't have. But no, not a hero. Just a person who decided to stop being quiet about something that mattered." Lily considered this with the full weight of her attention, which, at 8 years old, was considerably more substantial than most people gave her credit for. Then she nodded, in the way she nodded when something had been satisfactorily filed away. "Okay," she said. "But I think that's sort of what heroes are, actually." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he stood, and he took her hand, and they walked together down the long corridor toward the window and its view of the city, which at this hour was lit gold and ordinary and entirely possible. He submitted his acceptance on Monday morning. He wrote the conditions exactly as he had stated them. In the conference room, transparency in documentation, clear escalation paths, no retrospective alteration of records, and Victoria countersigned without amendment, which was itself a kind of statement. On his first day as Chief Systems Architect, he arrived early. He took the elevator to the 41st floor and stood in the corridor for a moment before entering the main workspace. The whiteboard in the conference room had been wiped clean. There was a fresh set of markers on the tray below it, still in their packaging. Victoria was already in. She passed his office at 8:15, paused for a fraction of a second in the doorway, and looked at him the way she had looked at him in those final minutes of their late-night conversation, fully, without the professional distance she maintained with everyone else, as though she had made a small but deliberate decision to let something she usually carried alone become visible for just a moment. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning," he said. She moved on, but she did not move on entirely. And they both understood this, and neither of them said anything about it yet. There would be time. That was the thing about starting from respect. It didn't arrive in a rush. It built the way good systems build, carefully, with redundancies and proper weighting, and a feedback mechanism that corrects for error rather than amplifying it. It built in a way that lasted. Outside the window, the city was doing what cities do on clear autumn mornings, producing ordinary miracles in every direction, most of them unnoticed. Elias opened his laptop. He had work to do. Good work, finally. Work that would stay on the record, exactly as it happened. Unchanged and unburied, and entirely his own. And for the first time in 6 years, that felt like enough.